G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here, back with my long-awaited inflation projection video and what that means for local government. Before I get into my actual predictions, which have proven to be unerringly correct thus far in the last few years, I'll go through the different types of inflation and what it means for local governments. I don't think everyone's very clear on it, so hang all the way through to the end if you want to know my prediction for inflation over this coming year. Of course, this is absolutely critical information for budgeting and for the long-term financial plans. But it's often the case that in my discussions with local government people that I find that there's a good deal of confusion about the two principal measures of inflation and what they mean to local government. The CPI inflation measure is the one that everyone knows, everyone talks about, most local governments are using. But what does it actually measure? It measures the change in price of a household basket of goods and services. You know, there's things like bananas and popcorn and the like in there. A lot of these items are things that local governments don't typically buy. Therefore, the CPI is often not the most appropriate measure of inflation. However, there is one caveat to that. If we're thinking about local government taxpayer ability to pay, then CPI becomes pertinent. Why? Well, all the welfare benefits are indexed to CPI twice a year. Most wages ultimately get indexed to CPI through EBA negotiations. So it has some importance as a measure of changes in capacity to pay, but in terms of a measure in changes to the cost facing local government, it's pretty irrelevant. Often the more appropriate measure would be the producer price index, which you can also get off the ABS website. Be careful to pick the correct sub-index for what you're interested in. So if you're thinking about infrastructure, you're obviously going to pick the civil engineering and construction index. Now, one other confusion I see a lot is that most state governments or their regulatory bodies produce a local government cost index, and people think they can rely on that. I would be loath to rely on those indexes. If you read the detail of them, you'll find that they're just made up of part of the CPI and part of the wage price index, and sometimes little portions of the PPI. It is not a good measure at all, and in fact, because it's half of each, it often doesn't achieve either purpose. So be very careful about which inflation measure you need to look at for which circumstance. And we need to also be careful about our forward projections about what's happening in inflation. As I've said before, the RBA has a vested interest in talking down our inflation expectations. They will not get the inflation back down to their target band unless people do believe that there's good reason to expect it to reduce. They need to talk it down. So what they're saying publicly, it could be incompetence, but a lot of it is what's referred to as jawboning. So there's lots of drivers of inflation. Friendshoring. That's the fact that we don't seem to like China anymore. More and more companies, both in Australia and overseas, are bringing stuff back to their own shores or back to other countries such as India that they feel are more likable. That will result in constant inflation pressures, because the reason why we sent everything to China in the first place was that China could produce a lot of these items much, much cheaper. The green EV revolution, I know lots of people are passionate about it, but there's a cost involved. If you're going to suddenly build lots of windmills and generate your electricity from that on that basis, you're going to pay more for your electricity. That should be rather obvious. So this whole green EV vehicle revolution is another driver of inflation. Wage pressure. People keep forgetting in Australia, most of us fall under enterprise bargaining agreements. they're negotiated for a period of time. That is why our wages haven't picked up as quickly as they have in some other countries. Now, my university still hasn't agreed on an EBA, and I think it expired at the beginning of last year, and it could be some time until they do. When they do, it will be going up considerably from the levels it had been in during the low inflation decade. Base effects. They are our friend at the moment because we had very high base numbers we were calculating changes from in the past. They won't always be our friend, and as time goes on, they'll be less useful to us and could sort of act as a headwind to getting inflation down. Excess liquidity. Most people will be aware of Milton Friedman's famous dictum that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary problem. It's the amount of money in the system that is the problem, according to Milton Friedman. And most conventional economists believe that, at least in part. Well, the reality of the situation is that global liquidity, the amount of money supply in the globe, is still increasing. That is not going to tame inflation. That's going to contribute to inflation. So countries such as Japan and China are still injecting liquidity into the global economy. We will live in a global world now, so that has implications for Australia. There are pressures on soft commodities. I know they went down of late, but people also don't realise that a lot of these soft commodities work with a 1 year lag. So soft commodities, when we're talking about things like grains. Services inflation. A lot of the inflation has moved from hard stuff to services, and it's a shifting inflation pattern which should be making people in the RBA very, very nervous. Reduced productivity. I've got videos about this before. Since COVID came, productivity has fallen through the floor. It will continue to decline because people are humans. They change their behaviors in response to circumstances. Those circumstances surrounding COVID, forcing people to stay at home and spend more time in recreation, some people not to be able to work, they have changed behaviours. It'll be some time until people revert back to those behaviours. Of course, there's more illness now too, because we weren't exposed to the flu and whatnot, and now it's catching up on us, so there's more sick days as well. So that's not going to help us either. Inflation expectations. I think more and more people are realising that what the RBA says is not going to happen. And as more people do realise that, the expectations become unanchored, and it's easier for companies to pass on higher costs to the consumer, which of course results in inflation. And we have the political tensions with Russia and America and China, and that is inflationary. So my call, I don't expect inflation to go down in any meaningful way. I'm not even sure it's peaked. I suspect it will go down and then back up again several times. I could think it will be around and sticky for a long, long time. The action the RBA has taken by putting up interest rates to dampen demand only really works if the interest rates are higher than inflation, and they're far lower than inflation. We still have negative interest rates, so I'm not expecting much relief from the demand side of the equation. And there could be more disruptions to the supply side, particularly if those international tensions take hold. So it will be sticky, a lot more sticky than most people are anticipating. I can remember when I said that we'd be hitting inflation well over 7% a few years ago, and everyone said I was mad, I didn't know what I was talking about, and look at inflation now. I think it's going to roll through different parts of things, and that's going to be something that CFOs and councils particularly will have to be very alert to. So the long and the short of it is you need to understand which inflation rate is pertinent to your situation. You need to start testing your long-term financial plans against the likelihood of higher inflation for longer. That is a very serious problem for some councils. I'm not sure that they will withstand those tests. So as soon as you get into this, as soon as you assess your financial sustainability and take remedial measures if necessary, the better it will be for your council, the better it will be ultimately for your community. Look, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more videos like this. I need to get positive feedback, otherwise I just won't produce them for you. It's as simple as that. I respond to incentives as well, just like everyone else. And I think this is important information that all councils need to be aware of. If you know people in CFO positions, senior decision-making position, councillors, and you don't think that they see these videos, flick it to them, because it's really, really important that they understand the situation properly. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.